second.
Is
Okay,
it funny?
it's all you, Matt.
Is it funny that I want to be like, okay, so let's keep our pet conversation going. Even though now that it's starting recording, people would have no idea why. Um, okay, so jumping straight into something to teach. I had an experience where again, I'm always coming into these wonderful webinars trying to figure out like what I want to share. And I'm, as you guys know, jump into the Q&A because it's my favorite to jump through and talk, go through your questions and whatnot. And I kind of always am looking for something to teach. And so I was thinking about, it was interesting. Okay, a couple weeks ago or a couple webinars ago, we talked about like how I would use the phrase somebody struggling with addiction versus a betrayed partner. And I started thinking about just how we often describe our feelings. And so if I say my partner is controlling, I'm now describing how I feel. I feel controlled. And it's an interesting place to be because the truth may be that my partner is controlling and that I am being controlled or I feel controlled. But at the same time, that may not actually be what's going on for my partner. So if I tell my partner, you're just a control freak or you're being controlling, it's a great opportunity for them to want to fight back. They feel attacked. How dare you? I don't feel controlling at all. Of course I'm controlling because you've hurt me and I'm scared, right? And it's your fault I'm controlling. Like we get into this weird dynamic. Or for instance, I thought of another one, my partner's an addict. They're just an addict, or you're doing this because you're just an addict or whatever. And if we start to look at our behavior, or one, it's looking at how we feel. So one, I feel controlled. One, I feel like my partner isn't attaching to me and they're attaching to other things. They're choosing to attach to their addiction, or they're choosing to attach to other people instead of me, right? We look at the behavior, but we recognize that regardless of the behavior, here's how it's impacting me. Here's how it's leaving me feeling. And so I can say to my partner, if I'm able to recognize that, I can say, hey, I'm really struggling, feeling controlled right now. Help me understand. Are you aware that this is controlling behavior? Is it not controlling behavior to you? If it's not controlling, what is this in your mind, right? And so that's where that getting curious thing comes in, and it's owning my side. Hey, I do feel controlled, and this doesn't feel good, and I don't like it. There is nothing wrong with saying that I'm feeling controlled. I don't like it. But in a healthy relationship, I'm able to say to the other person, if this isn't control to you, help me understand what it is. What is going on for you? Well, I'm scared. I don't blame you for being scared, right? Plenty of opportunity to now be empathetic and show up. So I don't know that I have a ton more other than just I would encourage people as you think about the way somebody else is impacting you. How are you recognizing it and communicating it to your partner or a friend? How are you letting them know how you feel, and then leaving room for them to share their perspective and what's happening for them? Now, even if they say I'm not being controlling, I can still sit in my reality of, well, that's interesting. You don't feel like you're being controlling, and I feel controlled. Now, we obviously aren't connected here because we're having two different experiences or two different realities. Connection would be seeking to understand their reality, them seeking to understand my reality, empathizing, having compassion, having understanding, and then once we feel connection, maybe working on a potential solution or ways that we can work together to see if there's something I can do for you so that you don't feel like you feel controlled, or something you can do for me so I don't feel so scared or hurt or whatever, and have the controlling behavior. And that is ultimately about creating safety and connection. So anyway, I'm curious, Scott, I'm going to kind of open it up to you and wait for all the questions to pour in.
I've got a couple of questions to get us started. And ask us questions, anything to do with how we describe our feelings or having feelings, or anything to do with relationships, addiction, and pop them into the Q&A. We'll get to them. But I mean, first and foremost, I mean, addicts are notorious for not being able to identify our own feelings. Why is that, and how do we get better at it? Because part of what you're talking about, how do we describe our feelings, if we're going to go through this process, we need, your first step there is, how do I feel? And for addicts, that's a really tough question.
Yeah, it has always been encouraging. That is not the word I was meaning to use. Intriguing, interesting to me when I ask somebody, how are you feeling? And they'll reply with a thought. Yeah. Right. And even somebody who's struggling with addiction, it's like, well, how are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling like I don't want to be here. I'm feeling like he or she doesn't like me. Like it's this cognitive thought process that's describing their thoughts, right? And those aren't feelings, right? There's this weird thing in our society and our culture where I'm trying to tell you what I'm thinking, but what I'm actually asking is, no, tell me what you're feeling. And we do that by asking somebody else, well, how are you feeling about this? Instead of saying, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And you might think it's semantics, but it's noticing that this is how the interaction occurs between us. And so if we recognize that, so if I recognize that I ask you how you're feeling, I'm taking a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's a good one. If I ask you, hey, how are you feeling? And you don't know how to describe it, but maybe you start telling me your thoughts, I'm now listening to your thoughts for what's underneath, what's the actual emotion you're really feeling underneath. And as an active listener, and I'm not even talking about me as a therapist, I'm talking as a friend, I'm actively listening to how you actually feel underneath, right? I actively heard underneath how you felt about the background being put up and listening to the powers that be. Underneath, maybe you were like, well, I don't really like it, but I'm going to do it anyway, and so I'm a little bit bothered, but hey, I need to do my part. There's emotions going on there for you underneath. Well, in any relationship, it's always best for us to try and listen to that emotional undertone. Regardless of what you tell me, I want to then reflect it back. So you're kind of bothered or, kind of annoyed. What is it about you not being able to show your home? Does it feel too stale to have the background up? And so now I'm getting a little bit more into your emotions around it, rather than me going, oh, well, hey, that background looks good. Or, oh yeah, do you hate authority? I'm just kidding, but
you're not wrong.
But so just keep in mind that we speak in this really interesting way culturally, and people are giving us emotion all the time. Everything you say, you're giving emotion. I'm giving emotion about my opinions on how we speak as a culture. And if you listen, you'd probably hear some frustration and how difficult it makes it for people to connect. There's also empathy and compassion, and I can see why it's so hard. We give out emotion constantly, even if we think we aren't. So one is learning to hear emotion in other people and look for it in the words that they say, without taking on all the judgment. But somebody who hasn't known how, you ask the question, why don't addicts know how to feel emotion? And that is such an in-depth question that I think is so dependent on that particular person. Typically, though, there's an environment where emotions weren't welcome, or certain emotions weren't welcome. So even the loss of one core emotion, if you look at just the core emotions, if anybody wants to refresh themselves on the core emotions and how and why they work, the Pixar film Inside Out's a great, cheap way to do it. But if we just go with the 4 core emotions, which is one less than the Pixar film, you have joy, you have anger, sadness, and fear. And so let's say you're in a home where sadness isn't okay. You're allowed to do anger, joy, and fear. Right now, I have to learn some other way to manage my sadness. I have to learn some other way to displace my sadness, move it somewhere else. Now, if you make it even more complicated and you're in a home where the only emotion that's okay is joy, or sometimes the only emotion that's okay is anger. And then even then it's not anger, it's rage, right? Then you're trying to find ways of feeling and experiencing emotions. And so, well, it's real easy for us to go, oh my gosh, alcohol, that is the warmest, most comfortable blanket I've ever felt in my life. Right? It's fantastic. I don't have to feel. And I was always told indirectly, maybe even directly, I'm not allowed to have emotions. So why wouldn't I go to alcohol or sex or drugs or food or whatever? And so why do we develop addictions? We're looking for some way to soothe, to calm, to comfort, to disconnect from our reality, disconnect from our pain. And then the answer to how do you learn to feel is slowly, right? The same way you would have learned as a kid, that's one reason I love that Pixar film, is because it's Riley learning, even if her parents were really connected, and they seemed like connective, supported parents in the film. And even then, she was getting the message, you're only allowed to feel joy. You're only allowed to feel joy. Be a good girl and feel joy for all of us. And part of that comes because the parent doesn't want to see their kid feel sad, doesn't want to see their kid feel hurt or angry or lonely. And so we go in and try and comfort. Let me help you feel joy. And the message the kid hears is, I'm only allowed to feel joy. Right? And so that's another reason, right? It's not even a home with abuse. It's not a home with trauma per se, and we can still ultimately become an addict, addicted to something, because what we've learned is I'm not allowed to show my emotions because it negatively impacts other people, even if that's not what our parents tried to send us. You were about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, being told that, no, you're only allowed to feel this emotion, is that not a form of abuse? Or at least a form of neglect?
Like, watch the Pixar film, because I don't think
they're lovely people, but yeah.
Right. But think about this, dad's changing jobs, so he's stressed out, and mom's, working on moving and all that stuff. And so she's stressed out. And so it isn't that we're directly told you're not allowed to have emotions. We're indirectly told we're not allowed to have emotions. And it could be the oldest child who, there's 3 more kids under the oldest child, and the oldest child indirectly is told, you need to be a big helper. You need to help the other kids. And so the oldest child starts to internalize this message. I'm not allowed to have anger or sadness because I need to be an adult. I need to be a big kid and be a parent. And I'm not saying that there is nothing we can do as parents or as friends or as family. We can't not send negative messages, because the message is often how the other person interprets it. So yes, I believe we can be in non-abusive situations and absolutely take on negative messages. And ultimately, I think we're less likely to become an addict of something, but we could still become an addict. And people are like, I don't get it. You never had any trauma. And it's like, no, I mean, there's maybe no direct abuse, but obviously somebody didn't see that I was going through something, which you could say is neglect, or they saw it and chose not to help me handle it. And then I had to go figure it out on my own, and I took up addiction.
Yeah. Or
We
stuff it. Yeah, we stuff it with addiction.
We stuff it, or whether I become a workaholic, whatever it might be that I start to use to numb and distract from my pain.
By the way, somebody did a hand raise thing, the electronic hand raise. This is a webinar, so we don't do that. But if you have questions, type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom or pop them in the chat feature. We will answer it.
So I'm going to now go to that next piece. You said, well, how? I said slowly, just like any kid would. And one of the most effective things I've found, which you put a link to, is using something like a feelings wheel or an emotions chart. And I tell people every day, look at the emotions chart multiple times a day and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Where do I feel it in my body? What does it feel like in my body? What seemed to trigger this? And start paying attention to your physiological responses. Pay attention to what emotions. Look at the chart and try to find words that describe how you feel. So, but this is a very slow process. And I think sometimes it's harder as an adult because our brains are usually fully formed by the time we're about 26. So if I'm 35 or 45 or 65, it's harder and harder sometimes to learn these techniques I needed to learn when I was 10 years old.
Yeah. And the follow-up for me here, and this is kind of something we've talked about before, is, as men in our society in particular are taught, it is not okay to have feelings. It is not okay to express feelings. Are we worse at it because of that? Or are men worse than women in your experience? I mean, it seems to me women are, if I ask a woman how she's feeling, she'll tell me. If I ask a man how he's feeling, he'll skirt the issue for 10 minutes,
It's an interesting thing because I think both sexes have issues with it.
Yeah.
Let's start with men. When men have an issue, I don't remember that it was research per se, but I remember reading an article that it was at least one clinician's, what I felt like a very well-formed opinion, describing this phenomenon in the culture that men are allowed to feel two things. Men are allowed to feel anger, and men are allowed to feel sexual. Which is funny because if you look at it, nowhere on a feelings chart is sexual an emotion, right? And you look at like the quintessential man, at least kind of in my mind and in a lot of people's minds, is going to be like James Bond. Have we talked about this? I swear we've talked about this. Long time ago, maybe.
We haven't talked about James Bond. I can tell you that. I would have remembered that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the James Bond character, right? He's stoic. There's nothing wrong with being stoic, by the way. I'm actually a fan of the Stoics, and we can get into that or we won't get into that. I don't care. But he's stoic. He's flat in his affect, and he's allowed to feel anger, which he shows through killing and blowing up stuff and wreaking havoc on the bad guys, right? Because in our minds, well, that's healthy anger, right? I can rage on the bad guys, and save the day and be the hero. So anger's healthy and okay in that mindset, right? And then he shows intimacy through sexuality. And so he's allowed to be sexual because that's intimacy, that's closeness. And I'm not condoning this in any way. I'm just using it, right? And so that so often shows what a man's man is supposed to be, what masculinity is supposed to look like, which is I can do anger because a hero has to have anger, and anger's fine, and I can be sexual because That's intimacy. So oftentimes when I work with men, they're that way, and I have to figure out how to go in and teach them and help them learn. Or I'll have another man who has tons of emotions and he's crazy embarrassed by it. And by the way, that stoic man has tons of emotions too. He's just learned to bury it, right? But I have another man who's ashamed of it. He's too emotional. He's too much. He's overbearing. Oftentimes he's been called gay. He's right. He's, it certainly isn't the man's man, if that makes sense. In fact, he must want to have sex with other men if he's having emotions like that. And so these terrible stereotypes on both ends. And so it's not to say that there aren't plenty of men with emotions, but men who have emotions and know how to communicate it are terrified of communicating. They don't want to be judged. They don't want to be seen as weak. They don't want to be seen as being feminine. And so they often won't. And they feel that they're not even allowed to. They have a lot of fear that even their wife doesn't really want to hear it because, if they're in a heterosexual relationship, right, they don't really want to hear it because they need me to be strong. So you get this crazy dynamic there. Well, then you shift over to the female side, and if there's a female who doesn't have emotions, she's a I'm like, all right, it's like we're on YouTube, but she's a female dog, right? Like, she's a witch, and so women who don't have emotions are basically said that they're mean, they're cruel. Women who have emotions.
By the way, Matt is not saying that women who don't have overly, expressive emotions are that. It's just saying it's society's perception.
Right.
Matt is not saying that.
Thank you for clarifying it, right? I'm trying to say that stereotypically this is where we go. But There's plenty of women who are more on the stoic side, more reserved, maybe even what we would say is an introvert, right? Even though that's a false classification of that, but that's how as a society we see it. There's plenty of women who are that way. And then you have women who are the other way, lots of emotions. Well, they're too much and they're a drama queen, right? Like, you get into this weird space where how many of us actually know what we're allowed to feel, how to feel it, how to communicate it. And so, yes, I would say stereotypically, it's a little easier for women to feel and share their feelings, but they run into problems too, than it is for men to feel and share their feelings. So the stereotypes have some truth there, that it's really difficult for men to learn how to feel and share. And it tends to be a little easier for women to know how to feel and share, but it doesn't mean either one of them is less challenged or has less societal pressure to show up a certain way. So it's just this. So I hope that answered the question, and I'm apparently
it does actually. I think
running with your question.
I have more questions, but we have some in the Q&A feature, and this is about
write them down because
the people here, not me. So yeah, we might get to some of my questions later, or I'll ask you in our next session. Anyway, first question in the Q&A here: what do you recommend to broaden the listening skills when someone has a hard time listening? Some people just never learned how to be active listeners, and maybe I'll ask you to relate that to feelings sometimes.
Oh my gosh. Well, the most incredible listener can actually hear what's going on deeper for the other person. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody that you're listening to is excited about that, right? In fact, I've been in social situations where, as an active listener, and that's what I'm trained to do, I've often replied back, hearing what's going on underneath, and people are appalled. And I'm like, oh, crud. I just pulled out more vulnerability than they wanted to share or that other people were comfortable hearing. And so I think, but to answer the question, what do I recommend? There is a very simple book that is not written by a clinician that I have always enjoyed. I've recently enjoyed, and I recommend to people on a regular basis. It's called I Hear You by Michael Sorensen, and that's an EN. And it is so, that book is like just less than 3 hours long on Audible or in an audiobook form. It's like $5 that you can buy the booklet. Basically, it's a book, and it's cheap. That book is really good at teaching just some really simple but wonderful skills on listening, asking questions, staying out of defensiveness. And there's a few other books too. There might be books I haven't read that I would love. If anybody wants to send one my way, I'd be interested in seeing what you guys like. So first of all, gain the skill, start reading, search for web articles on listening, look for tips, try to pay attention to who you think is a good listener and see if you can figure out what it is that they do, and then practice emulating those skills. The other thing I would highly recommend is ask somebody, hey, I want to be a better listener. Can I practice you talking to me and me practicing some of my skills? And so literally ask someone to practice. Let's see here.
I love that you picked the Audible version of the book for a question about listening.
Well, I'm so into Audible now because I can do it while working out. I can listen to books and, while driving my car, it's like, I don't have to sit down and read, but yes, I did say, go listen to it. But being a good listener isn't just hearing. Being a good listener is actually learning to reflect what you're hearing and giving the other person an opportunity to take in your reflection and then give it back until you're a good listener when the other person essentially is able to say, oh my gosh, you get me, or yes, I feel really understood. And I can't emphasize this enough. Don't think that active listening is agreeing with the other person, right? I can listen to people quite a bit and I don't agree with them at all, but I understand where they came to the conclusion and why they've come to the conclusion that they have. I ask a ton of questions so that I can come to that conclusion of, you make sense to me. I don't agree with you. I would have come to a different conclusion. In fact, can we explore together what a different conclusion might look like, right? Like, being a good listener does not mean you agree with the other person at all. It means that they make sense to you. If they don't make sense, you're not a good listener.
So let me ask you this question, and I think this is a relationship dynamic that we see a lot of times with betrayal and addiction and just dysfunction. My mother, lovely woman, is a terrific active listener until you have an emotion. And then it's a brick wall. She shuts down. And do we see this in relationships impacted by betrayal? Let's not pick on my mother too much, but I mean, it's too much for her to handle. She can't handle it.
It's really hard because that is more of what I call, she's an active content listener. Like, you have to separate it out. To me, a good listener isn't somebody who can just hear the content. It's somebody who knows how to actually show up and be present. Like, again, I don't have to agree with you, but I can hear your emotions. I can feel your emotions. You make sense to me. And I have, I have more love and appreciation for who you are as a person than I did before we started talking. Right. So your mother learned the content skills of listening quite possibly out of just pure survival. Yeah. Sometimes other people who we're friends with don't know how to go emotionally deep either. And so we just need to learn how to be good content listeners with each other. And now we have a good friendship. And neither one of us want anything deeper. Right. Because we're both uncomfortable with it. And we're actually really good friends because we don't go to the emotions with each other. Like, there are people out there and that's their relationship. Yeah.
But typically in like a primary relationship, I mean, the addict, the one thing we don't want to be is present for reality. I mean, that's why we're addicts. We're
Well,
escaping for, I mean, that it's deeper than that, obviously, but
no, for sure. But like, here's the interesting thing. I've worked with couples or known couples, right, who neither of them wants to be any deeper than content. Maybe there's no major trauma in the relationship, and they don't, in my opinion, have a very close relationship, but they're both content. That's the life they want. And so you're in this space where the truth is we're going to go, like, eventually, to some degree, going to find the type of person we want to be with. If I want to be with somebody who doesn't know how to go deep and make me uncomfortable, I'm going to find that type of friend.
I
Now,
mean, in out of there in the Prodependence book, Dr. Rob has a whole chapter about this. It's like, twos don't marry eights, in terms from an emotional standpoint. And it's like people who want a certain amount of contact don't want somebody who wants 10 times that. We find our level.
Right. And where, from a prodependent standpoint, right, that I'm going to jump in here because I believe Dr. Rob is actually teaching this concept. We get mixed up in that phrase. Twos don't marry eights,
Yes.
Hockey players don't marry ballerinas, right? Like that. And so if I'm a betrayed partner and I hear that, I start to hear, oh my gosh, you're telling me that I'm a two, right? And the hard part is, the way I actually see it, somebody might be an eight, or at least long for an eight relationship, but they themselves don't totally know how to do it. And so they think, oh, well, we're going to get married, and I trust that I'm going to give my whole heart, and he or she's going to give their whole heart, not realizing that they have an addiction. And we're going to figure out how to have an eight relationship together. And that is one of the most beautiful, trustworthy, kind, wonderful things that a partner can do, because I have hope and I see the best in you, that we are going to grow to have this amazing relationship. So maybe that partner who got betrayed had the heart of an eight, but didn't know how to have the skill of an eight. And so just trusted in their heart that we're going to figure out how to have an eight relationship together. And so they have the skill of a two, maybe, or a three or whatever. And then they marry somebody who maybe was doing their best to fake it, and they want to have an eight relationship, but they don't know how to get rid of this addictive behavior. And so ultimately they lose hope because they don't know how to get rid of the addiction. And then they say, forget it. And then you have this colossal betrayal relationship. Yeah. Is that too much?
I don't know. Oh. Yeah. We're talking about emotionally a two and emotionally an eight. And usually, by the way, it's the addict who's the emotional two. Whether they started out that way or not, the addiction has dragged them down to an emotional two, and they've shut down and they're not listening.
And the further and further we get into our addictive behavior, like the more disconnected and numb and like buried layer by layer against our emotions. And so we have to then kill the addictive behavior over time, because that's usually not a super quick fix. Right. And then start to dive into all these layers that we've buried the emotion in. It's a terrifying place to go.
Yeah. And my whole point under all this, and like asking the question about my mother, was sometimes we don't listen because we don't want to feel. And
oh gosh, yes.
Yeah, we just shut down, and we have to learn how to feel.
We don't want to feel. We were never taught how to feel. I mean, most likely, you don't need to go into it, but if you ask the question, like, what was your mom going through that she never learned how to feel?
Yeah, her mother died early. She was the oldest child. She was parentified, blah, 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 blah.
Right. And so then she takes this thing into her marital relationship, and she raises her kids with this. And then one of her kids becomes an addict, right? Like, and so I say one because I only know you, but like, so you look at that situation and go, it's probably not even that she's ever made a conscious choice. Hey, you know what? I don't want to have relationships where I feel. And so I'm going to avoid feeling and having I'm going to avoid emotions. That's just what she's done to survive her whole life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question here. Could you define prodependence?
I feel so inadequate defining prodependence.
You want me to pull Dr. Rob's definition from the Proto website?
Well, so that's the funny thing. If they want me to give my answer, I'll totally give it.
Why don't you give yours? Yeah.
The way that I would describe prodependence is that we need to be heavily, actively dependent on each other in a way where I don't need to be with somebody or put up with behavior to prove my worth and have dependence so that I feel better about myself. I need to have dependence because that's what's healthy in my life. And so I might choose to be with a partner who's struggling with an addiction, hoping that they get their stuff together. And I do that out of love. I do that out of connection. I do that out of my desire for being close to that person. And I'm not unhealthy because I desire to be close to somebody who's unhealthy. So we want to be prodependent. We don't want to be independent, right? We don't want to be codependent, if you will, if you were going to follow that model, which basically says that I'm sick for wanting to have dependency with somebody else who's unhealthy. And it's like, no, I get into my marriage because I want dependence on you and you want dependence on me and we want healthy dependence on other people. We just need to learn to do it in healthy ways, not in unhealthy ways. So that would be, I guarantee you, Dr. Rob's definition is way better than mine. So go.
Okay, here's Dr. Rob's from the website, which I have to figure out how to get there again. Sorry, there it is. I'm sorry. Rob, and this is him speaking about prodependence in terms of addiction relationships. So prodependence is intended to improve the ways we treat loved ones of addicts and other troubled people, offering them more dignity for their suffering than blame for the problem. With its attachment-focused view, prodependence pushes aside the flaws of the codependency model, which generally suggests that family members of addicts need to detach with love. And if they don't, neither the family member nor the addict will change or grow. That advice typically leaves loved ones of addicts feeling confused and misunderstood rather than supported and validated. Prodependence celebrates and values a caregiver's willingness to support and stay connected with an addicted or struggling family member.
Prodependence is not new. Right. In fact, the best definition I can give you for true prodependence is a secure attachment.
Yeah.
So why prodependence? Well, prodependence is really Dr. Rob's way of fighting against the shame that a person could have by staying in a relationship or trying to help a loved one in an addictive situation and feeling shame about loving another person, right? So what he's really tried to do is to introduce the word prodependence to say, let's stop shaming people for loving somebody. But a true prodependent person is somebody who has a secure attachment, which means they're comfortable with autonomy and they're comfortable with intimacy. So if I'm uncomfortable with autonomy, I need other people to make me feel secure. If I'm uncomfortable with intimacy, I'm trying to be independent, and people getting close to me makes me feel insecure. We want to actually feel both. I'm comfortable by being by myself at times, and I'm comfortable being with others and having intimacy. I can handle whatever comes my way by being close and not being close, and I'm good. I can do both. That truly is what prodependence is. When you remove it from the concept of let's get rid of the shame around loving somebody.
Yeah, a prodependent relationship is I trust that you will be here when I need you, and I trust that you'll be over there when I need you to be over there. And I trust that I will fill in your weak spots for you, and you will do the same for me when it's needed. But without trampling your boundaries, I'm there for you, and vice versa. And that's secure attachment. And you described it way better than I did. But yeah, prodependent relationships are secure attachment relationships. And that's a very healthy way to be. And there are 4 people on Earth who are securely attached, and the rest of us are here.
That's not actually true, but that's funny.
Yeah.
We got a few questions we got to jump into.
I know we're gonna have, this is gonna roll over till our next session, which is cool. We'll have a Q&A next time. Can a sex addict in recovery 1 year go without sex for a long period of time beyond the 90-day abstinence?
Okay, so in the meantime, I don't know if you need to start copying and pasting some of the questions in case we don't get to them. But so for right now, let me just answer this quick. Can they? Sure. Anybody can go without sex. You can go without sex the rest of your life. You'll be fine. There may be moments of discomfort. There may be moments of some anxiety or physiological discomfort as well. But the question is it healthy? So the 90-day abstinence, the whole concept there is that it's believed to bring the chemicals down to a healthy baseline. And so if I've gone 90 days, even if I'm married, go 90 days without looking at porn, without masturbation, without, this one's a little bit harder, but without engaging in lustful, deep, lustful thought processes. And again, that's not easy when somebody's first working through it, but being mindful of trying to stay out of that sexual place for escape. After 90 days, that you come down to a baseline level, and now we're not fighting the chemical addiction, if you will, in our brain. And so now interestingly enough, what we can do that is not healthy is we can eventually move into a space where we develop sexual anorexia, where we're now avoiding sex because we don't want to face the emotions and the pain and everything else that's underneath it. So we're avoiding intimacy. So, but if you have a situation, I'm going to make a broad statement, and there is some nuance, but if you have a situation where you have a sex addicted spouse who's reaching to the other person and saying, hey, I want to be sexual, even if that's not the most healthy place for them to be in, hey, I want to be sexual because I'm feeling stress at work and I'm feeling disconnected, can we be sexual? That actually is a bid for attachment, and a sexual experience there could still actually be very healthy for them because they're learning to reach for their partner and get a response. Now, I'm going to remove the betrayed partner's trauma from this for a second, because it does not mean that a betrayed partner needs to be okay, I'll be sexual even though I don't want to, right? You always need, as a betrayed partner, to recognize your consent, if that makes sense. So if you recognize, well, we're not as deep as I want to be emotionally, but I'm willing to engage sexually, and it's okay because we're learning over time, then you're just being patient while you learn the process. So if you're asking the question, is it healthy to go beyond the 90-day absence? I would say very generally, no. Is it unhealthy? Not necessarily, right? If a betrayed partner needs to go beyond the 90 days, that's fine. But I would encourage you to work with your individual therapist on figuring out why. What is this block to intimacy? And don't engage sexually until you're ready. I would never tell you to do that. But there will be some risk at some point that you're going to have to take to engage sexually. But that whole 90 days thing is really just about resetting the chemical makeup in the brain to a baseline level. So, but yes, after 90 days, we need to watch for the nuances and be careful that we don't really move into a sexual anorexia phase.
Yeah, and that actually happens a lot with addicts when they get sober. Sometimes they'll move into they're so afraid because they haven't had anything other than addictive sex, even with their partner, for such a long time. It scares the living Jesus out of them.
Oh, totally. And it's not healthy. In fact, I can't tell you how many partners I've worked with who are like, I want my spouse to be sexual. I thought they were a sex addict and now they won't have sex with me. And it's like, yeah, that's sexual anorexia. And that is not healthy either. It may feel a little less painful because then it doesn't feel like they're cheating on you somewhere else. But I don't know that it always feels much less painful because they're still not choosing me.
Yeah. And there's a process to work back from that. It kind of starts with, just getting in touch with yourself and your body and your five senses, and then learning how to touch each other in non-sexual ways, and then how to, and be emotionally intimate. And then you slowly kind of reintegrate sexual stuff and you take the pressure off.
Totally. You can totally do it in phases, right? It can start out where week one, we're just going to be, we're going to engage in non-sexual touch, right? And Kim Buck and I developed like basically a 90-day plan. And like, if I remember right off the top of my head, like week 2 was be naked around each other, but no touch, right? Like there's different phases of introducing this very vulnerable, scary part of intimacy to where at the 90-day mark, it's engaging in sex. And so anyway, it's not just boom, suddenly do it. Throughout that 90-day process, you can do it in stages.
Yeah. Next question here. I love this one. It's right on target with everything today. What if the emotion that I'm feeling is based on a distorted way of interpreting messages, and it's a total disconnect with what's actually being said? I often get anger, resentment, and defensiveness from my husband. In other words, I might suggest he take his blood pressure meds and cholesterol meds when it's clear he's chosen to avoid taking them because he forgets or he's put them off. He's in the medical field, promotes the importance of this, but he lashes out and says I criticize him. What he's not hearing is my concern over his health.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of what we've been talking about, active listening and feelings. And yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, when I'm working with couples, it's always based on a distorted way. If we aren't connecting, we are distorting what's going on for the other person. I want to say that definitively, and I'm totally open for that to not be a definitive statement. But so this is a perfect example. No matter how good I get at this, I can't guarantee, no matter, and you betrayed partners, I hear this from you the most. Oh, I try to say it perfectly and he gets mad no matter what, right? Or she gets mad no matter what. And so you don't want to make the focus on me saying it perfect so he learns to hear me, right? However, if I go to him in this case and say, hey, I have some concern, I really care about you and I don't want to lose you. And so I'm wondering if you've taken your medicine today, because I love you and I'm worried. Now, if we even move into it and say, hey, I'm worried about you feeling criticized, but I want to share with you my concern. I've now started out with my emotion of worry. I worry, it's my worry that you're going to feel criticized. But I want you to know that I'm actually nervous or scared about your health. And I love you so much, I don't want to lose you. And so it would make me feel better if you took your medicine. But I realize that's your choice, right? That may be a little easier for him to hear, but I can't promise you he's still not going to feel criticized and defensive and shut you down, right? Because that's his shame coming up. But that's totally distorted interpretation of your message. And perhaps you could work on saying it better, but I hate saying that because the truth is you could say it perfect and he still doesn't hear it. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that answered it very well. There's kind of some comments in here. This is in reference to the emotional 2, emotional 8. Says my ex sex addict would tell me he was into deep conversations and connection, and he was able to do that in sobriety. But when he relapsed, he went back to the emotional 2, and it's this individual has had another year of self-growth, getting herself back to, I'm assuming, her back to where she was,
right.
As an emotional 8 before, because he kind of dragged her down with her.
Well,
Do we see that?
Yeah, in that relationship, when you have something like a relapse, and we're talking about a relapse where the person really goes back into the addiction, not a slip where they mess up. In fact, a slip can actually teach you that he's now at an 8 because he slips up and he comes to you within 12 hours. I'm using he because that's the example here. That he comes back to you within the 12 hours and says, hey, I slipped. I feel terrible. I'm so embarrassed to tell you. And suddenly you realize he is an 8. Just because he slipped doesn't mean he's not an 8, right? How he handles this slip shows you his progression and that he's an 8. Now, if he has a relapse and goes back and is isolating and is acting out and is not disclosing, then yeah, he could easily be back to being a 2 because now his shame is taken over and he feels embarrassed and has all these faulty core beliefs that you're never going to love him and he's never going to amount to anything or whatever it is that's happening. And so, yeah, it totally makes sense that you're having that roller coaster of an experience as he has been trying to learn how to basically manage or unmanage his issues.
Yeah. We've got one more in this regard, and then I'm going to save all the rest of the questions for next week. I promise we'll get to them. So that's my situation. I have the heart of an 8, but my skills are much lower. I'm hoping my husband and I can become an 8 together. Do you see that happen?
Oh my gosh, yes. Right. Like I see that happen all the time. In fact, that's what's so beautiful about the recovery process and why you guys are here. You're here because you have hope, right? And at the same time, I've seen where he's a 2 and he becomes a 5 and you're an 8, but you are so, and you recognize that he has the heart of an 8, but he only ever shows it as a 5, and you somehow mend that gap to where you realize, he's an 8. He just doesn't know how to let other people know. And it feels so good. She's an 8 and she just doesn't know how to let that out, but I can feel the 8. And it actually feels just as good because you can see the intent and the heart of that person, even if those skills are really lacking or struggling. And it's this weird space where you start to recognize we don't need to become the same. We just need to recognize it and see it within each other and share it in our own ways. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. And don't shoot for an 8, shoot for a 9 or a 10, by the way. I mean,
well, we talked about 2 and 8 because I think that was the example that you gave. But
yeah,
but the reality of it is we all don't stay where you're at. Constantly figure out how to progress. And a true 8 is constantly learning. A true 5 is if you're a 2 and now you're a 5, you're constantly trying to figure it out and learn. And sometimes for different reasons, our partner will never be capable of the skill set of an 8. And that could be because our partner's on the autism spectrum, or they have a personality disorder, or whatever might be going on, right? They may never have that skill set, but they may be trying. So hopefully that helps you guys.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an amazing discussion. We have a ton of questions left. I have copied and pasted them. I will save them for 2 weeks from now. If it's okay with Matt, we'll just pick up this discussion where we left off.
Let's do it. Yeah, I'm totally happy. You might send me the list of the questions, and sure. Maybe I can even, who knows, maybe I can even find something else.
Prep in advance. Okay, yeah. I will do that. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for killer participation today. We love that.
Somebody did ask the question where they can find the progression into sex after 90 days. If you email me M Wheeler, so like Matt or Matthew, M Wheeler, WHEELER at familystrategies.org. Shoot me I don't think Kim will care if I send that out. She and I came up with it. I'll ask Kim and find out. Just to make sure.
Yeah, you can also email me and I'll forward it to Matt if you didn't get his.
Oh, yeah. Email, if it's way easier, honestly, it might even be better to email Scott. Sometimes if I get flooded with emails, it's hard for me to go get them all, but I will get to it eventually. So
yeah, just click the contact us button and say in the subject line, this goes to Scott, and then and that way it'll make its way to me.
Yep. And just ask for the 90-day, sexual plan, and I can try and help out with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. That was awesome.
So, this is my wheelhouse. I love this stuff, like the emotions and connection. Oh, you guys bring this, and let's keep figuring out how to be a more connected, loving, and lovable people. And this will change not only your spouse relationship, but this will change your relationship with your kids and your friends. Like, even if your spouse doesn't change, this will make your life be more wholehearted, and it feels so much better than being alone and in pain.
Yeah. All right. We will see you in 2 weeks. As always, reach out if you need anything. We're always here for you. Be well. Have a great weekend. You too, Matt. Have a great weekend.
See you guys.